So, for the last several weeks throughout Advent into the Christmas season, especially in our first readings, we heard lots of prophecies about the coming of the Messiah, Emmanuel, Jesus. We heard prophecies from Jeremiah, Baruch, Zephaniah, Micah. And today, in our first reading, we heard another prophecy, this time from Isaiah. While those earlier prophecies were really about the coming of Jesus, his incarnation in what we now call Christmas, this prophecy related to that, but also is fulfilled particularly in the gospel reading that we just heard on this feast that we celebrate of the baptism of the Lord. In that Isaiah reading, Isaiah is speaking in the words of God the Father of God's servant who is to come, that we now know is Jesus. And you may have noticed some parallel language between that first reading and our gospel. In Isaiah, speaking of that servant that is Jesus, God speaks of him as my chosen one, with whom I am pleased. And as we just heard at Jesus' baptism, the voice of God was heard saying, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Isaiah, speaking for God in that first reading, spoke of Jesus as the one upon whom I have put my spirit. And at Jesus' baptism in the gospel, the Holy Spirit descends on Jesus in bodily form as like a dove. God puts his spirit upon Jesus. And that, in particular, is brought up by Peter in the speech he's giving in the second reading that we had from the Acts of the Apostles. He is speaking to Cornelius and his household. Cornelius is a centurion for Rome, and he is a Gentile, as are his household and his friends. And Peter is trying to convey to them very quickly, succinctly, who Jesus was, that they might become his followers. And in that speech, Peter says that God anointed Jesus with the Holy Spirit and power. And we live in a soundbite world now, right, where you have to convey a lot of information in a short period of time, a few phrases or sentences. I'm going to go on way much longer than that in this homily. But poor Peter had this task of trying to convey enough information about Jesus and all the amazing and wonderful things he did in a very short period of time. And he simply says, describing all of Jesus' ministry, he did good and healed those oppressed by the devil. That's basically all he says to describe the entire ministry of Jesus. And we, having heard the scriptures, read the Bible, studied the life of Christ, we can fill in the blanks of what that looked like, all the miracles and teachings and everything that Jesus did. But for these folks, a couple decades after the birth of Christ who did not know his full story, this is not too simple to simply say Jesus went around doing good and healing those oppressed by the devil. But there is a simplicity that is elegant in the wisdom of God. And if you go back to that Isaiah reading, when Isaiah talks about this servant that we know is Jesus and how he would operate, Isaiah says that chosen one would bring justice. How? Not by shouting, not by trampling on the weak or taking advantage of them, not exerting worldly power, not snuffing out a smoldering wick or breaking a bruised reed, but with mercy, simply mercy. And this is really the simplicity, the elegant simplicity of the greatest commandment that Jesus speaks of elsewhere in the Gospels when asked, "What is the greatest commandment?" And he simply says, two things: love God and love your neighbor. And that's what Peter and Isaiah call out, describing Jesus. As Peter said, Jesus went about doing good. You do good for others. That's loving your neighbor. And he went about freeing those who were held down by the devil. And if he acted against the one who opposes God, the devil, that is displaying a love of God. And then Peter speaks of us, of anyone that should follow Christ, and says that all people, all nations are acceptable if they do likewise, if they fear God, having a healthy respect and awe for God, that is, loving God, and if they act uprightly, again, love of neighbor. Isaiah says that the Lord calls us to a victory of justice after he describes this servant that is Jesus and what the implication of Jesus is for us, that he calls us with him to a victory of justice. And what does that look like for Isaiah? It looks like God taking us by the hand. What a beautiful image he uses. If we allow God to take us by the hand to be part of that victory of justice, that is loving God. You hold the hand of someone you love. And Isaiah says that we are then to be lights to the nations, to bring light to those in darkness, physical or figurative, and that is love of neighbor. So as we celebrate the baptism of the Lord to honor Jesus, it is also occasion for us to remember our own baptisms and recommit to our baptismal callings and responsibilities, which really are summarized in the greatest commandment of love of God and neighbor. In fact, the rite of baptism. This would be the rite for the baptism of a child, an infant, one who the parents are speaking for. And the parents are quizzed a bit at the beginning of the baptismal rite. They're asked what the child's name is that they are claiming responsibility for and bringing to the sacrament. They're asked if they want to have their child baptized. And then this statement is made. In asking for baptism for your child, you are undertaking the responsibility of raising him or her in the faith, so that, keeping God's commandments, she may love the Lord and her neighbor as Christ has taught us. There it is. The greatest commandment. Love God, love our neighbor. That is our baptismal call in a simple, elegant nutshell. And then the parents are asked, do you understand this responsibility? So I ask us all tonight. Do we truly understand this responsibility that we have as the baptized to act on that understanding, to love God and to love neighbor? And there are times when, if we're honest with ourselves, we might say, I'm not sure if I understand it or if I feel up to it. Am I worthy enough for it? Am I able to actually carry it out? Or if you are not yet baptized and considering it, you may be asking yourself, am I worthy of taking on that responsibility? And I would point us all back to that second reading from the Acts of the Apostles. And I would encourage everyone to go back and read the full story. The readings at Mass, we always get a snippet, right? If you go back to the beginning of that chapter and read the full story till the end of that chapter, it's really a beautiful and amazing story. Cornelius is this Roman centurion. He has 100 archers under his control, part of the occupying army. But he's described as being a God-fearing and devout man who prays constantly. And he's an almsgiver to the Jews, people not even of his own nation, people who he is over. He is fulfilling the greatest commandment in his life. He's praying constantly. He loves God. He gives alms to people that aren't even his own. He is loving his neighbor. And after Peter gives his speech to Cornelius and his family, the Holy Spirit descends on that group, similarly to Pentecost. And Peter says, why would we not baptize these folks? And they are baptized. So even a Roman centurion of an occupying army can receive the Holy Spirit and receive baptism. And that is exactly what Peter was saying in that speech about Cornelius and his family and about all of us and our attempts to fulfill our baptismal call and responsibility. Truly, God shows no partiality. Whoever fears him and acts uprightly is acceptable to God.